Greetings, and welcome to Chapter 3. In this chapter, we'll essentially address the question that focuses on what are the implications of a country's political economy on its level of economic development and its environment for doing business. To answer this question, we'll focus on a country's political economy and its influence in the economic development within that country. We'll look at higher levels of economic development that create a more favorable environment specifically for international business. It's a lot like examining a company that you want to invest in, whether you want to work for them or you want to invest your own money into that organization. Their makeup in terms of the corporate governance, who's running it, how they're running it, really influences your decision on whether or not you want to engage with that organization. The same principles apply when it comes to nations and really entering into those markets. Now, a country's level of economic development affects its attractiveness as a possible market entrance for an organization or production for your company's parts, essentially. Whether or not you're entering that market to produce parts in your value chain, or whether or not you're entering that market to sell to the people in that market, there are several metrics you can utilize to help gauge whether or not that might be beneficial for your organization. They fall along the lines of the gross national income of that the country, or the purchasing power parity, which is adjusted up and down depending on the standard living for those individuals and different countries, essentially. Now, there are certain people that are highly influential, and they argue that development should be assessed less by material output and more by capabilities and opportunities that essentially people enjoy. Sen is one of those individuals. In fact, the United Nations has created a human development index based on life expectancy, education attained by people in that country, and whether the average income are sufficient to meet the basic needs of living in that country. And it really reflects Sen's idea, engages a country's economic development and likely future growth. So the philosophy being espoused by Sen is that instead of measuring what they're doing now, let's measure what they could be doing in the future, their potential. And we know that potential really based on how educated are these individuals in the country, how are they living their lives in terms of being able to meet your basic needs? It's a lot like, well, our life here in the United States. If we're constantly struggling to put food on the table, then we won't necessarily aspire to greater things. Higher levels of need won't necessarily be targeted, essentially. So this notion of human development index is really supports Zen's idea, essentially. Now, if you ever run into a question such as this, a true or false question that asks, true or false, the purchasing power or parity of a different country is adjusted up or down depending on whether the cost of living is lower or higher than in the United States. The actual answer is true. To account for differences in cost of living, one can adjust the GNI per capita by purchasing power, and the basis for the adjustment is the cost of living in the United States. The purchasing power parity for different countries is then adjusted up or down depending on whether the cost of living is lower or higher than in the United States, essentially. So let's go ahead and dive into this topic in a bit more depth and ask the question, what is the relationship between political economy and economic progress? In order to understand the answer, we really have to focus on economic freedom in a market economy and really how it creates greater incentives for innovation, entrepreneurs, and really helps an economy to grow. And part of this is, espoused in our Western culture. Essentially, individuals who have the opportunity to run the business the way they want to run the business without interference from the government has a lot more motivation to experiment. There will be more entrepreneurs in that market because of that freedom. If you contrast this to other countries that have a totalitarian dictatorship, the ability for entrepreneurism is really limited. Hence, the relationship between economic development is closely tied to the form of government and how much freedom is essentially there. For a country to sustain long-term economic growth, the business environment needs to be conducive for innovation and entrepreneurial activity, so that there is constant new products being created, new processes being discovered, new organizations being formed, and new management practices being established, new strategies that are rolled out that yield potential success. Entrepreneurs need to first commercialize and innovate these products and these processes before they can essentially become mainstream. Now, countries with high economic freedom have high economic growth and essentially richer citizens. When we look at, say, Hong Kong, Singapore, the US, Canada, and Germany, these are great examples of capitalism and the benefits that it can bring. Now, there are downsides to that, and we can get into that later, essentially, as we saw the financial crisis that took place as a result of bad mortgages and deregulation. In general, there has to be a balance of corporate governance from a government standpoint and also from a a freedom standpoint for organizations to operate freely. Countries that lack economic freedom also fail to achieve respectable economic growth, and we've seen this time and time again. So here's another question that you might run into here in the near future. Although countries such as China and India are currently relatively poor, meaning their citizens don't have a lot of purchasing power relative to other countries, their economies are largely growing and in absolute terms very attractive, if you will. So their economies are large in absolute terms and growing more rapidly than those of many advanced nations. The answer to this question would be true. So although China and India, in terms of their middle class, being less equipped for purchasing products versus the middle class in the United States, it's their potential that really puts them at a different level, and it's why companies want to go to China, why Marriott wants to go to China, why our company tried to go to China, and also India, if you will. To dive this, to get into this a bit deeper, we also have to understand that strong legal protection of private property is another requirement for businesses to really grow and prosper, and for entrepreneurs to feel secure and take those risks that are needed in order for growth to happen. Individual businesses really must have the opportunity to profit from innovative ideas, essentially. Now, democratic regimes tend to be more conducive for long-term economic growth than dictatorships, even the benevolent kind. And the reason why this is because limiting human freedom also suppresses human development and therefore essentially limits progress, if you will. If you run into this question sometime in the future, which I highly think you will, you can essentially answer false, because the gross national income, or the GNI per capita, comes much closer to Sen's concept of how development should be measured than narrow economic measures such as the Human Development Index. Actually, nothing can be further from the truth, as we talked about earlier. Sen's idea is let's measure potential rather than current production, if you will. That's why the United Nations came up with the HDI, if you will. So democracy is often a consequence of economic growth. As economies grow, there is a demand from the people to have a more accommodating government and protection for their own rights. And this has contributed to the attitude of many Western governments towards human right violations in China. If China establishes a free market system, it's hoped that greater individual freedom and democracy will follow as China starts to enter into our economy and we enter into their economy. Hopefully more individual rights and freedoms will be available in that part of the world, if you will. Now, there are other factors that influence a country's rate of economic development, and some of these factors include simply where they're located, the geography, and essentially countries with favorable geography are more likely to engage in trade and can promote economic growth. The amount of education, as we talked about earlier, is another factor. So countries that invest more in the education of their young people develop faster economies. If you ever run into this at some point, a true or false question, I highly encourage you to argue that it's a true statement. Economists who argue that innovation and entrepreneurial activity are the engines of long-term economic growth and define innovation broadly to include not just new products, but also new processes, new organizations, new management practices, and new strategies. This is absolutely 100% true. It's more than just new companies and new processes, but it's really the refinement of the business process, if you will. Now, since the late 1980s, a wave of democratic revolutions have swept the world essentially, and many of the previous totalitarian regimes have collapsed. And there's been a move away from centrally planned and mixed economies to really more free market economies because of the prosperity of capitalism in certain parts of the world and people buying into that thought process. Democracy has spread to new countries, largely because many totalitarian regimes failed to deliver economic progress to a majority of their population. New information and communication technologies have broken down the ability for the state to control access to uncensored information. And economic advancements of the last quarter century have led to emergences of increasingly prosperous middle and working classes who push for this democratic establishment, as we've talked about. I'm sure you're going to run into this at some point. So if you see a question that asks true or false, if a country's economy is to sustain long-term growth, the business environment must be conducive to the consistent production of products and processes, innovation, and to entrepreneurial activity. There's this common theme of freedom for entrepreneurs, and this question is true. A country's economy to sustain long-term growth is rooted in its people's ability to improve their processes, to find these differentiators in the marketplace that allows them to sell products and bring value to the world. And a lot of these efforts are driven by entrepreneurs. Now, at the end of the Cold War and in the New World Order that followed, the collapse of communism in the Eastern Europe section of the world, and the former Soviet Union, taken together with the collapse of authoritarian regimes like Latin America, have really given rise to intense speculation about the future of the world as we know it. Geopolitical forces can affect how companies operate in certain countries, and it becomes a focus, if you will, as we see different governments succeed and fail. Since the late 1980s, there's been a transformation from centrally planned command economies to really more market-based economies. And we've talked about this before, how capitalism is benefiting the world, and people are catching on to this trend and really the value that it can bring. I'm sure you're going to run into this question, true or false. Entrepreneurial individuals have fewer economic incentives to develop valuable new innovations in market economies than planned economies, if you will. You got to pay attention to the wording here. Entrepreneurs have more incentive than planned economies to develop these new processes because they're directly rewarded for their activities. So the answer would be false, if you will. Entrepreneurs are incentivized and have more economic incentive to develop valuable new innovations in a market economy than planned economies. So if somebody's telling you how to do it, and they've been doing that for a number of years, and they don't give you an opportunity to think about how to make it better, then chances are you're not going to seek those opportunities to make it better. Now, there's been a shift towards these market-based economies and these systems, and the shift can be identified through certain movements such as deregulation, privatization, and really the creation of legal systems to safeguard property rights. So let's dive into each element in a bit more depth. Deregulation. It involves removing legal restrictions, and really opening up free play within the market. Now, there has to be a balance because of Sarbanes-Oxley and just the natural tendency in corporate America for greed to grow. There has to be a balance there. But in terms of deregulating and regulating, we tend to go into cycles of regulation, deregulation, regulation, deregulation. But in general, a relatively free economy is ideal in terms of establishing growth. So removing price control is a big factor in this process. Abolishing laws that limit private entrepreneurs to establish their businesses. Really removing restrictions on foreign investment and trade also falls under this process and philosophy, if you will. You're going to run into this, a true or false question, and if you do, I would answer true, because strong legal protection of private rights is a requirement for a business environment to be conducive to innovation, entrepreneurial activity, and hence economic growth. When people feel protected, they're willing to do more. They're willing to invest more. They're willing to take more risks, essentially. So if I had a business and I had the risk of the government coming in and taking my business away, I would be apprehensive of growing that business because there's always that risk. But if I know that my rights are protected through the legal system, then I would be more apt to take those risks. Privatization is really the transfer of ownership of state property to private hand investors. Sometimes this is good, sometimes this is bad. But at the heart of it, the philosophy is that private investors are motivated to seek profit and to improve those properties, if you will, and the effects are more successful when they are accompanied by more general deregulation and really the opening up of the economy. Now, market economic growth requires a well-functioning legal system. That means it really should protect the property rights, and we've talked about this. Many countries have made significant strides towards it, and as they continue to do so, we'll see that improve. That is their economy. You'll see this question here in the near future, I predict. It's another true or false question. Totalitarian states that limit human freedom are highly conducive to progress in terms of innovation, entrepreneurs, and economic growth. Again, pay attention to the wording because the answer is false. Democracy brings these innovations, these economic growth that we keep referring to. Now, markets that were formerly off limits to Western businesses are really now open. So we're talking about China, we're talking about India because of their growing population. China with 1.3 billion people, India with 1.2, and really the potential for that market to develop in terms of their middle class. However, just as the potential gains are present, there's also risks because of the government that's in play. China, Google got kicked out for a while. They're trying to go back in. Marriott's there, Hilton's there. My company is there and is struggling. But there's so much potential that it has to be a risk that's perhaps taken, if you will. Let's talk about the implications for managers. What are the implications of a political economy for international business? Well, essentially, the overall attractiveness of a country really depends on the balance between the likely benefits of doing business in that country and the costs that are associated, and even the risks that are present. So we'll explore that idea in a bit more depth here. So you will run into this question here in the near future, and I just want you to be prepared for it. The answer is false. Sachs has argued, according to this question, in terms of true or false, that tropical regions have a more extensive division of labor than temperate regions, and actually it's the opposite. The influential economist Jeffrey Sachs has argued that temperate climates have generally supported higher density of population, thus a more extensive division of labor than tropical regions. So his argument is that temperate climates have more people in it, higher density of population, thus more extensive divisions of labor versus tropical regions, if you will. So let's keep moving. Now, the benefits of doing business in a country are really a function of the market size, the current, future, and consumer purchasing power available to the middle class. And by identifying and investing early in these potential economies that grow, firms can be really the first movers and reap that benefit of the growth. But again, this has to be balanced when it comes to costs. Firms must be prepared to deal with the cost of doing business in a foreign market. And costs can vary from political costs that include paying bribes or lobbying, which some people think are bribes, for favorable or fair trade conditions. Those are the economic costs related primarily to the sophistication of the economic system. It include maybe infrastructure supporting the business. There's a legal costs that can be higher in some countries than other countries, and it all has to be taken into consideration. Another true or false question for you. During the 1980s and early 1990s, totalitarian governments collapsed and were replaced by democratically elected governments. The answer is actually true to that, and we've seen it throughout this presentation. Now let's talk about the risks. Doing business in a foreign market involves risks, and that could be political risks that focus on the likelihood of a political force that will cause drastic changes in the country's business environment and adversely hurt the profit of that company and their investment there. There's also economic risks, the likelihood of economic mismanagement, which will cause drastic changes in the country's business environment. We can think of Greece and the issues that they're facing, and legal risks. And that revolves around the likelihood that trading partners will break contracts, and what are the safeguards in place to essentially protect those agreements, if you will. The overall attractiveness of a country as a potential market or investment site for international business really depends on the balance of the elements that we've discussed, the benefits, the costs, and the risks that are associated with doing business in those countries. So just generally, the risks, if the risks are lower, the costs are lower, then it could be more attractive. And it's potential that really drives companies. So sometimes even push through the risks and the costs, if you will. So your book actually has a nice diagram that talks about the attractiveness. What are the benefits? What are the costs? And what are the risks?